I'm Jareh. I'm here at Pond Society in Shanghai to inaugurate the exhibition Public-Private, a group exhibition of 12 international artists exploring themes that have to do with interiority and exteriority, landscape, nature, through contemporary painting. So this diptych by Adeniyi-Jones, Projection Riven, really is quite a stunning work where the artist inserts his image or a likeness of his image into the scene. It looks like it's a cabin, and there's this warm glow, almost acting as a filter across his body and across the space that he's in. A lot of Anthony's work inspired by classical art history, landscape paintings, portraiture. He often works from archives, representing queer lives in his work, himself as a queer artist, but then also really this interplay between past and present, sort of interesting and astute study on color field paintings that he introduces into his work. So different themes overlapping. In a way, he's sort of making this his own new language for contemporary painting. Caroline Walker, with this work, a work on paper, study for disturbed. Caroline Walker is an artist who is really sort of individualizing women's lives in intimate interior settings. Like Adeniyi-Jones, we have an interior scene. Here it's the interior of a residence in Hollywood Hills. Walker had documented a former American pageant winner in her home, but also this sort of interplay between public and private life, where you have someone who would have been in a very sort of prominent public role because of her career in pageantry. Dominic Chambers is an American artist who represents a more restful and leisurely interpretation of Black lives, thinking of the context of African Americans in the US and a history of transatlantic slave trade, that usually there is an interpretation of the Black body as a labor force, but he counters that by showing Black bodies in nature, in natural landscape. So the work on view is of a young Black woman sat on a windowsill in this mesmerizing, almost dreamlike landscape. And he wants to represent a different world and a more sort of peaceful and joyous space for Black people in his paintings. So there's two works by Jonny Negron, Vitriol, as we can see in the title. The title of the work is inscribed on the painting. I mean, both works of a sort of familiar orangey flame-like palette that Jonny has worked on for a couple of years, really thinking of an intersection of comics and anime, and this emotion of fire, sort of highly charged emotion, but not necessarily something dangerous, but something that conveys a transformative emotional states. And then in the next painting, Poison, there's a few signifiers that speak to a contemporary moment, and advertising imagery in popular culture and magazines. And this idea of holding something luxurious and desirable, holding this forbidden apple, a fruit, in this gesture. So there's overlapping meaning in his work. Slappey is an American artist who grew up in southern United States, and her work very much looks to this idea of American girlhood identity, a sort of idealized view of femininity. I mean, this work is just, really stunning and quite psychological in terms of the perspective that it's portraying. We see a female-looking limbs and hands in a work that looks like the body is falling back in a shower. So the title of the work is Slip and Fall, and then you get caught in trying to preserve composure, to hold on to. There's a razor that has also fallen and cut the person. And she's really sort of thinking through the psychological aspects, as I mentioned, labor involved in keeping the body beautiful and perfect and disciplined, and the sort of absurdity of these regimes imposed on women's body. Choi also similarly is dealing with societal constructs around Asian women's identity, growing up in a conservative Korean society, and the sort of ideals of women within that society that dictate how you're meant to behave, who you're meant to become from girlhood to womanhood. Here it's a scene based on Joshua Tree, a sort of cactus field in the Mojave Desert. And we have this woman who are like, it's almost like they've come together in a sort of celebration within cactus, but they are embodied by the cactus. And so a lot of her work has dealt for a long time with a sort of giving women agency and a resistance to the traumas and oppression of women in society. Here is a space that they can be exactly who they want to be in a way that is true to who they are. Moving on to Tunji Adeniyi-Jones, a British artist of Nigerian descent, who's very much looked through West African modernism, modernist artists of the 1950s and 60s in Nigeria and beyond, that were working in a post-colonial space where a lot of these artists were defining who they were as African artists, looking to their environments. One of the artists that influenced Tunji Adeniyi-Jones is the late 𝗏𝗏, who created silhouettes of the Black figure in bronze in his drawings and etchings. And this form of the silhouette is something that Tunji Adeniyi-Jones has worked on over and over in his paintings. But rather than prescribe a racial identity to them, he's looking at figures from a space of mythology and folklore. So public-private overall, is this inquiry into painting today by a generation of artists in their 30s to 40s who live in different geographical locations across the world. They're all working with different methods and making painting their own, making it an individual language for discussing a range of themes that have to do with identity, representation, and also inner and interior lives that we often are not sort of privy to as a public. It's really sort of thinking about history painting through a contemporary lens, and also just really coming back to this idea that painting is a form of art that has existed for centuries, and it's potent and evolving side that artists continue to explore, probe, and make their own in meaningful ways.